This is a map of the aftermath of the Second Russian Civil War, one of the deadliest conflicts in modern history. Originally, my idea for this video was to explore a world where Gorbachev never passes the Glasnost and Perestroika reforms, and instead he focuses on more limited reforms. As you know by the title and thumbnail, this seemingly small change snowballed into the brutal Second Russian Civil War. Grab some popcorn, sit back and relax while we explore how the lack of Perestroika and Glasnost led to this catastrophic outcome. Before we dive into it, let me briefly explain what the Perestroika and Glasnost reforms even are. There were two infamous reforms, both conducted by Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union. Perestroika means restructuring and Glasnost means openness. With these reforms, Gorbachev tried to fix problems in the Soviet Union, mainly economic stagnation, corruption, and political isolation on the world stage. Many people claim that these reforms were the primary factor in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It's hard to know what the real main factor was, but it's safe to say that they played a role in the way the dissolution happened. They both faced significant implementation challenges and played a crucial role in showing the public the flaws of the Soviet system. They led to more widespread nationalism, especially outside of the Russian Soviet Republic. Before we dive into the impacts of their absence, we need to talk about how we can stop the reforms from happening. An easy solution would be to just have Gorbachev never come to power. However, I believe that would have far-reaching consequences way beyond these reforms. Instead, we will change who Gorbachev was mentored by. In our timeline, Gorbachev was mainly influenced by reformists within the party, like Yuri Andropov and Nikita Khrushchev. Instead, we will have more conservative figures within the party influence him, mainly Andrei Gromyko. He was the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs and played a crucial role in many important policies, like the disarmament. He had a reputation of being a hardliner, but in reality he was heavily in favor of improving relations with the West. He was an influential role in the Soviet Union, and I believe that it's not too far-fetched for Gorbachev to be inspired and influenced by Gromyko. Gorbachev's early career takes a slightly different turn. Due to Gromyko's influence, he is a noticeably more conservative version of himself. I believe that with this small change, Gorbachev would not implement his infamous reforms. Of course, that doesn't mean that the problems he tried to tackle don't exist. The Soviet economy is in decline, even if the broader population doesn't know about it. At the same time, corruption and nationalism become increasingly urgent issues. Let's find out how a more conservative Gorbachev handles these challenges. So now that we've established a more conservative Gorbachev, what's next? It's not like he will magically ignore the problems the Soviet Union faces. His main focus is still to address these problems, he just does so in a way more gradual and slow manner. He mainly allows for slow media liberalization, with very strict oversight from the Communist Party. Imagine newspapers, the radio and TV slowly taking more liberal stances, while the Communist Party heavily overlooks everything. However, this doesn't have the effects he wishes for. Even small snippets of Western culture and mentality are enough for a decent part of the population to become enraged with the current situation. Instead of completely reforming the Soviet economy, Gorbachev tries to focus more on investments in technology and infrastructure. He also implements anti-corruption measures, however with less effect than in our time. The Soviet Union maintains stronger central control over the economy. The decentralization and liberalization of Perestroika is completely avoided. State-owned enterprises continue to dominate, with some small incentives for innovation. At first, this seems to be working just fine. Internally, within the party, nobody is really opposing Gorbachev in the same way they did in our time. However, the economy is still stagnating. The conservative leadership maintains a strong stance against the West, avoiding the diplomatic shock initiated by Gorbachev's actual policies. This results in continued Cold War tensions, though without escalating into direct conflict. While the disarmament still continues, there is no McDonald's opening in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union continues to support allied socialist states and movements worldwide, but with a focus on stability rather than expansion. These smaller and more controlled reforms lead to short-term stability. The initial disruption caused by Perestroika are completely avoided. However, the solutions are only short-term. At this point in history, the Soviet economy was doomed to fail. Despite controlled reforms, the Soviet economy continues to stagnate due to inherent inefficiencies and lack of innovation. This leads to growing dissatisfaction among the population, particularly among younger generations who seek better opportunities. In the 80s, the internal tensions within the Union rise. While the public is less opposed to the war in Afghanistan, since it gets less media coverage, however, other issues are very apparent, even with stricter Soviet control. For example, the youth is growing more and more unhappy. They are romanticizing the West. Due to Glasnost never happening, they are exposed to way less Western medium, but every tiny bit that spills over stirs the pot. The repression of opinions grows resentment within the Soviet population, especially regions outside of the Russian Republic, such as Ukraine, the Baltics, and Soviet satellite states are unhappy. Ethnic minorities begin to organize and protest against the Soviet system. Nationalism is spreading like a wildfire, and Ukrainians, Georgians, and many more yearn for their own state outside of Soviet control. Intellectuals within the Soviet Union also begin to grow resentment. In the 80s, many leave to go to Western countries like the UK, West Germany, and the USA. The Soviet Union suffers a heavy brain drain, which just furthers the issues already apparent. With each year passing, other countries like the UK and US gain a higher technological advantage over the Soviet Union. In 1986, global oil prices crash. This affects countries around the globe, but the Soviet Union is hit especially hard. Its economy is reliant on oil, and thanks to the increasingly low demand, many people become unemployed practically overnight. With the economic situation worsening, many citizens, even those who are not highly educated or part of a minority, begin to question the Soviet system. Satellite nations of the Soviet Union take notice, and in 1987, protests against Soviet control break out in many major cities across Eastern Europe. The protesters demand their countries to move away from the Soviet Union and align themselves with the West. Some protests turn into riots, especially in Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, and East Berlin. Gorbachev is faced with a difficult decision. If he intervenes, the riots might turn into full-on rebellions that could spread even into the Soviet Union itself. On the other hand, if he does nothing, he could lose control over important strategic puppets like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and many more. At first, Gorbachev decides to let the countries deal with the riots themselves. This proves to be pretty ineffective. The riots worsen and reach their first peak when in August of 1987, protesters attack a Soviet military facility in East Berlin, killing 2 Soviet soldiers and injuring 5 more. Gorbachev makes the decision to intervene in East Berlin with full force. He mobilizes 10,000 soldiers to take control and occupy the city. The Western world is stunned as tanks begin blockading the streets of East Berlin. The already heavily protected Berlin Wall gets reinforced with even more soldiers. Now nobody can escape East Berlin. The world holds their breath as Soviet forces clash with German protesters. The protesters are heavily organized and use their knowledge of the city to their advantage. The Soviet forces struggle to hold control in Berlin and are often forced to resort to violence. The protesters use guerrilla warfare tactics similar to those we saw in Chechnya in the 2000s. They're heavily organized in underground networks, and West Germany smuggles supplies to them regularly. Within 2 months, over 200 protesters and 45 Soviet soldiers are killed, and many more injured. Criticism against Gorbachev grows both inside and outside of the Soviet Union. Inside the party, people urge Gorbachev to continue the suppression of the riots. They fear they would lose control of the situation if they back down. However, we can't completely change who Gorbachev was as a person. While he's more conservative due to different influences in his career, he is still Gorbachev. He orders his troops to leave East Germany. Within hours of the Soviets leaving, the country goes up in flames as the Stasi clash with armed protesters in East Berlin and other cities. After only 2 weeks of the riots, a bomb attack by protesters kills Erich Honecker, the then leader of East Germany. The government resigns, the Stasi is discontinued, and a provisional government is set up by the protesters. Gorbachev and the Soviet Union can only watch. East Germany immediately begins negotiations for reunifications with the West. The Soviets try their best to diplomatically pressure East Germany, but the US strong-arms them and threatens with military action if the Soviets intervene again. Even before Germany is officially unified, both East and West Berliners begin tearing down the Berlin Wall. On the 24th of February 1988, the provisional government of East Germany and the West German leadership officially declared their unification. Berlin is set up as the new capital, and the Berlin Wall is officially declared to be over, even though it fell 2 weeks ago. The Soviet leadership is furious, and many even demand the resignation of Gorbachev. The Western world, and especially Germany, celebrate this victory. Hopes for a more peaceful and unified future grow stronger. The United States, similarly to our timeline, decides that the best course of action is to not intervene directly. Instead, they focus on supporting Germany and help ensure democracy and peace remains in this newly unified nation. At the same time, Gorbachev is faced with heavy criticism from within the Communist Party. Many blame him for the failure that was Berlin. Gorbachev strengthens his stance to let countries deal with the riots on their own. Thanks to the successful unification of Germany, rebellions break out in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Ukraine, Moldova, and the Baltic states. Many within the Soviet Union notice where their countries headed. The KGB, with the help of many hardliners in the Communist Party and military officials, begin to plan to overthrow Gorbachev and his government. Because Perestroika and Glasnost never happened, a bigger part of the population is still loyal to the Communist Party and the Soviet Union. They blame Western influence and nationalists for the internal political issues. Many within the Communist Party believe that the cause for the current issues is Gorbachev's incompetence, not deep internal issues. At this point, the Soviet Union has practically no control over its satellite states in Europe. The fear grows that Gorbachev is allowing the Soviet Union to fail. Throughout 1991, discontent within the Communist Party and the military reaches a boiling point. Hardliners led by Vice President Gennady Yanayev begin to covertly plan a coup. Key figures include Vladimir Krichkov, the head of the KGB, Dmitry Yazov, the Minister of Defense, and other senior military officers and party officials. They form a state emergency committee to coordinate their efforts. The conspirators hold secret meetings to plan the logistics of the coup, ensuring they have the support of the KGB, the military, and key government agencies. They identify strategic locations to seize, such as the Kremlin, communication centers, and major transportation hubs. On a cold December night in 1991, the coup begins. Gorbachev is at his dacha in Crimea, unaware of the immediate threat. KGB operatives storm the residency, detain him, and cut off all communication. He's flown to a remote location where he's kept under strict surveillance. Simultaneously, military units loyal to Yanayev move into Moscow, seizing key government buildings, including the Kremlin, the Ministry of Defense, and state broadcasting station. Tanks and armored vehicles roll through the streets of Moscow, establishing control and intimidating any potential resistance. At dawn, the State Emergency Committee makes a public announcement on national television and radio. Yanayev, flanked by his fellow conspirators, declares that Gorbachev is incapacitated and that he has assumed leadership to save the Soviet Union from collapse. He promises to restore order, suppress nationalist movements, and maintain the integrity of the Soviet state. Yanayev imposes martial law, suspends political activities, and bans public gatherings. A curfew is enforced, and dissent is met with swift and brutal repression. The news of the coup spreads quickly. In Moscow, thousands of citizens take to the streets in protest. Led by Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Federation, they gather around the Russian White House, demanding Gorbachev's release and denouncing the coup. Yeltsin climbs atop a tank and delivers a passionate speech, calling for general strike and urging the military to defy the coup leaders. His defiance becomes a symbol of resistance, inspiring the population and drawing international attention. Despite Yeltsin's efforts, the situation rapidly deteriorates. Loyalists and rebel factions within the military clash, resulting in violent fights across the country. In major cities like Leningrad, Kiev, and Tbilisi, large-scale protests erupt, met with brutal crackdowns by the coup leaders. Many parts of the military declare their loyalty to Yeltsin and join his side. At the same time, regional leaders in the Baltics, Ukraine, and Central Asia declare their independence. Yanayev declares all these to be illegal rebellions and declares war on them, and anyone loyal to Yeltsin. The Second Russian Civil War has begun. As the Soviet Civil War, or as many call it the Second Russian Civil War, begins, the sides become clear quickly. First are the coup leaders led by Yanayev. This faction consists of hardline communists and military leaders determined to preserve the Soviet Union and crush all resistance within Soviet borders. They control the central government, significant portions of the military, and the KGB. Their main goal is to save the Soviet Union and crush any opposition. Their initial base of operation is in Moscow. The second major factions are the forces led by Boris Yeltsin. They are fighting for a free and democratic Russia. They are supported by many reformists within the Soviet Union and have a large popular support. Their main base of operation is also within Moscow. The beginning of the civil war is marked by heavy fighting in and around Moscow. The general population within the city is beginning to fight a guerrilla war against the central government. Yeltsin's forces managed to occupy the headquarters of the KGB and many broadcasting stations. Thanks to their control over the radio, they broadcast calls for rebellion all over the Soviet Union, leading to many more riots against Soviet forces in cities around the Soviet Union. Sensing the opportunity for independence, local leaders in Ukraine, the Baltics, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Russian Far East begin to organize the nationalist rebellions. Their main goal is to break free from Soviet control and establish independent nations. After the initial chaos, they form an alliance with each other called the UEFN, the Union of Eurasian Free Nations. Their main headquarters in Kiev. Other important centers are Vladivostok, Odessa, Riga, and Baku. Their control is spread over different pockets. Huge fights over many important cities quickly erupt all over the Soviet Union. The most brutal fight is the Battle of Moscow. Brothers are murdering each other in the streets, while artillery shells rain down on strategic locations from both sides. The city quickly sees large-scale destruction and casualties skyrocket. After 2 months of brutal fighting, the central government is forced to evacuate the city. While the battle for Moscow was raging on, another very important fight was occurring, the battle for Leningrad. This fight is yet to be decided. However, the central government quickly realizes that their chances of occupying and keeping Leningrad are slim. While many Soviet forces continue to fight for the city, Yanayev and the main bulk of the Soviet army flee to Perm, a city close to the Urals. There they manage to build a stable foundation for a long-term fight. After taking control of Moscow, Yeltsin begins negotiating with the UEFN, and they officially sign peace between them. They don't have any shared interests besides defeating the Soviet forces. They agree to establish the borders of former Soviet SSRs and oblasts to avoid conflicts. While there are still many large-scale fights going on, especially in Ukraine, after 3 months the initial dust settles. While Boris Yeltsin and his Free Russia control Moscow and St. Petersburg, the Soviet forces still control the bulk of the Soviet Union. The UEFN slowly makes progress as Soviet forces are spread thin. Instead of vigorously defending every city, Yanayev and the Soviets focus on establishing a stable region under their firm control. It becomes clear to the world that this wasn't a short-term conflict. The US begins heavily aiding Boris Yeltsin and his forces, but are reluctant to send ground forces or airplanes. Many Eastern European nations like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia send volunteer forces to different regions of the UEFN. The Czechoslovak volunteer force is especially successful in helping with liberating the Caucasus. Many nations within the UEFN quickly declare the desire to join the EU once their independence is guaranteed. This strengthens their public support. In a call with George Bush, Boris Yeltsin declares that Russia will join NATO once the war is over. Both the UEFN and Yeltsin's Russia have secured their support from the West. The world begins to wonder what happened to the Soviet nuclear arsenal. After the initial outbreak of the civil war, the world was left speechless. Many believed that the conflict would be resolved quickly, but now it's clear to everyone that it's a large-scale, long-term conflict. Boris Yeltsin begins preparations for a march towards Perm. Simultaneously, the Free Russian forces begin coordinating with the UEFN and manage to liberate Rostov and Stalingrad, which they quickly rename to Volgograd. As the Soviet forces are forced to heavily retreat in almost every direction, Yanayev begins to threaten to use his nuclear arsenal. During the initial chaos, his forces manage to secure roughly 15,000 of the 27,000 nuclear warheads the Soviet Union possessed at the time. Yeltsin's Free Russia has roughly 6,000 nukes and the UEFN holds further 3,000. At least those are the official numbers. Who has how many in reality and what happened to the remaining 3,000 nukes is unknown. As the Caucasus gets further liberated, Yanayev publicly broadcasts a threat of using a nuclear warhead on Baku if the separatists don't lay down their arms. The world is stunned. Within hours, both the UEFN and Boris Yeltsin broadcast counter-threats and claim that they have nuclear warheads ready to be deployed over Perm and other Soviet targets. All three sides rapidly begin to ready their nuclear arsenal. Both the US and UN try to de-escalate the situation without any success. Yanayev further doubles down on his threat and announces that if any nation sends foreign volunteers into the civil war, his nuclear weapons will strike down said nation. He specifically threatens Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. The world is stunned for several weeks, with paranoia becoming widespread all around the globe, especially in Europe. Huge peace movements erupt in practically every Western nation, and people begin to party in the streets as they believe they're living their last days. The US government is heavily debating on how to react to the rogue threats of Yanayev. After days, they've come to a conclusion. The US government quickly sets up a call between George Bush and the leader of each faction. He talks on the phone with Boris Yeltsin, Gennady Yanayev, and Vyacheslav Chornovil, the de facto leader of the UEFN. He declares the same thing to all three factions. Whoever launches a nuclear war first against whatever target will be attacked by the US nuclear arsenal. The move is a huge gamble, but the US government feels like there's no other option to stop anyone from trying their luck. Within hours of the phone calls, the word spreads. Many believe that George Bush completely lost his mind, and now broad masses are convinced of incoming nuclear war. People in the US and other Western nations turn to the streets, and huge riots break out demanding to denounce the US threats. The situation has never been this tense since the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, just threatening the use of retaliatory strikes wasn't the entire US strategy. A team of US diplomats led by James Baker, the Secretary of State, travels to Beijing to meet with representatives from the Civil War. They begin top-secret negotiations for a truce. All three sides have realized that the only way their nations can survive is if they can agree to a peace treaty. While Russia is immediately in favor, both the UEFN and the Soviet Union need more convincing, as they would lose huge amounts of territory they feel belongs to them. The US manages to convince the UEFN within hours. The Soviet Union needs more strong-arming. Vladimir Krichkov, the head of the KGB, is quoted shouting at Baker to stay out of foreign affairs. Baker responds by shouting back, "Nuclear affairs are world affairs," which turns into a popular quote that is often referenced and parodied. After 2 more painful days of negotiations, Baker manages to convince the Soviets to sign the truce. The US will pay war reparations out of their pockets to save the Soviet Union's economy. The US also allows Yanayev to stay in power, and the Soviet Union gets to keep huge amounts of territory in the Russian East, claimed by the UEFN. Also, Russia and every UEFN nation needs to remain neutral, meaning they can't join NATO. However, UEFN nations inside of Europe are allowed to join the European Union. So is Russia. The world breathes a heavy sigh after the truce is announced. Many quickly declare James Baker to be the savior of the world, and he gets featured as Time magazine's Person of the Year. However, not everyone is happy as the world begins to heal from this traumatic event. The Second Russian Civil War lasted from December 1991 to July 1992, less than a year. However, due to the large-scale urban fights with advanced weapons on each side, it caused almost 2 million casualties and left the world traumatized. All nations who came out of the Civil War are devastated and paranoid. Millions of mothers watched their sons kill each other. Both the Soviet Union and Russia immediately begin fortifying the border the truce set up. It quickly becomes the most heavily fortified border in the world and is nicknamed the New Iron Curtain. Both Russia and many newly found European nations quickly begin to work towards joining the European Union. They focus their efforts on rebuilding and strengthening their democracy. Within less than 3 years, Russia, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, the Caucasian states, and Kurelo-Murmansk joined the European Union. All the nations of the former UEFN sign a mutual defense treaty closely inspired by NATO. This infuriates the Soviet Union, but besides making vague threats, they can't do much. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union closely aligns itself with China, and they begin to rely heavily on the Chinese economy. The world has to cope with having witnessed a large-scale war once again. While the casualties weren't nearly as high as in World War II, it is by far the most talked about and studied conflict, even in the 2020s. Citizens in Russia and the newly formed nations try to cope from the war through means of art and literature. The Russian music scene thrives, with many Russian artists becoming the most listened to artists in the world. Their music effectively captures the feeling of hopelessness so many felt during the crisis. In the West, many movies and video games depict the events of the Second Russian Civil War. The Call of Duty series, for example, completely focuses on the Russian Civil War. Thanks to the internet, huge amounts of high-quality videos from the war are shared to millions of people. I don't know if you can remember, but in the early days of the internet, one would often stumble across gore, even if you weren't looking for it. Imagine an entire generation being traumatized by pictures and videos from a brutal civil war. The broader Western population views Yanayev as the clear villain of the whole conflict. His threats of nuclear war and widespread racist attacks against minorities within the Soviet Union led to comparisons between him and Hitler. The opinions on George Bush are mixed. Many believe his harsh response was exactly what was needed, while others believe he unnecessarily escalated the situation. Boris Yeltsin is viewed in a very positive light, as he is responsible for Russia being closely aligned with the West. He becomes a central figure in Western politics in the next decade. James Baker is viewed as a hero and enjoys a huge rise in popularity. Thanks to that, he becomes the next president after Bush. As politics within the US become more popularized, the fear grows that the United States isn't immune to a similar conflict happening. However, thanks to the lessons learned in the Russian Civil War, many realized that radicalism isn't the answer. I hope you enjoyed this alternate history scenario about the Second Russian Civil War. If you're interested in a more detailed exploration of the conflict's aftermath, let me know in the comments. I'd also love to hear any feedback you have or ideas for future scenarios. As a new channel, your support means a lot. Please consider subscribing or sharing this video to help me grow. If you like this scenario, you might also enjoy my video on a world without nuclear weapons.